Alright, today we're going to be tying a hair jig with two materials. Well, outside the jig head. For the jig head, we're going to be using these Strike King jigs. The Redfish Magics. They're really nice. And for thread, I'm using Vivis 150 gel spun. The gel spun is going to allow us to put a lot of tension on the synthetics and the bucktails that we're going to be using for this hair jig. You just want to make sure with gel spun that you give yourself a lot of thread wraps and a good thread base, because the gel spun is super slippery. For the tail, we're going to be using Flash and Crinkle. It's got a little bit of flash in it already, and it's got a really good length, and it's pretty cheap, so it's a really good alternative for these jigs. Just want to put that on top and put a lot of pressure on these synthetics because they don't compress, so they can be slippery. Then I return to the shank, go back on the material, go back on the shank, and really get some nice strong thread wraps so that's not going anywhere. I like to pre-taper, as you can see, my tail. I think it's easier to do it that way than cutting it, but you can always put it on there now and cut it if you want. Since we doubled it over, you can kind of see where this is kind of separating a little bit. So just run a comb through it to incorporate all the materials, and you'll get a little bit better, see what your shape of your jig's going to come out to be. That looks pretty good. Now the rest of this is super easy. It's just two clumps of bucktail. For this piece, I'm going to be using one that's fairly low down on my bucktail, so it's going to flare a little bit. But I chose some bucktail that's really wavy, so it's going to give a lot of good motion on this jig when you're jigging it or stripping it. And you want this first piece of bucktail to extend about halfway down the tail. And you can clip that. Depending on your bucktail, you might have to reverse tie this first piece. For me, I'm not going to have to because this is going to flare the amount that I'm looking for. But you can use whatever you want, flare it how much you want to kind of get the profile that you're looking for so you can match the hatch. So I just did some loose wraps and pushed it around, and once I was happy with it, I flared it. And now once I'm happy with that, put a lot more tension on it, and I'm going to wrap through those tag ends. That just really ensures that this bucktail isn't going anywhere. And once that's secure, I'll kind of look at my taper, see what it looks like. I'm going to wrap back over the bucktail just a little bit, get that a little bit smaller, but not too much. That looks pretty good. Now come up in here, give yourself another thread base again. On this jig, on the jig holder part of the jig, you're going to want to use more bucktail than you think because the diameter of the material keeper is going to eat up a lot more material than you think. So I'm going to come down and I'm going to grab which looks like an absurdly big clump of bucktail. But by the time we clean out the bottom, the loose fibers, and spin it around that material keeper, it's not going to be outrageous. It's still going to be fairly big. This is a big jig. So if you're tying it smaller, you can go smaller. I'm going pretty big on this one. So brush out all your under fibers. We don't want those. They're not going to do anything for me. Now this deer hair, kind of like the first piece for me, I am not going to have to flare it. Just because this stuff is I can just feel it. It's really hollow. So it's going to flare quite a bit. So you don't have to get too crazy with doing a reverse tie or anything like that. I'll just be able to tie this in right on there and spin it around. So this one's going to be just slightly shorter or the same length as the orange, just to give yourself that nice bait fish taper. And now since I put so much bucktail on this, I want to do quite a few wraps. You can already see that it's starting to flare. So that's why I'm not going to have to reverse tie or anything this piece. Bucktail, you kind of have to do things. Each tail will kind of tell you what it needs to do, and each tail kind of has different purposes. So I like that, and I'm pushing that right up against the jig head. Once I'm happy, I'm going to start putting some tension on it, and you can see how much this piece is flaring. That's pretty good there, right there. So I'm just going to tighten down, really use this gel spun, go through all those tag ends quite a bit. This is going to give you a lot of durability and life to your jig. I'll come in and trim these tag ends. You're not going to get all of them on a jig like this, but you can get it down so your head's not quite so crazy. And now just work on covering up all those tag ends. I like doing it this way rather than cutting it because it kind of just ensures that this bucktail isn't going anywhere. Now, once I get that part done, I guess, I'm sorry, there's 3 materials in this. I need to grab some Ripple ice fibers. This first clump is gonna be an olive. I'll take it out of the pack. Split and stack it so you get all the fibers facing the same direction and you only have the long ones. I'm going to thin that out a little bit more. That looks pretty good. And now this is going to be the same length as your olive. And you're just going to do a loose wrap and kind of wrap that around the top half of this jig. This is going to cover up those thread wraps. And it's also going to give us a little bit more flash in this jig because I keep these pretty sparse in relation to flash, at least for me. So this Ripple Ice gives it what it needs to. And now we're going to come in with our next color, and it's going to be orange. So Ripple Ice fibers, like most synthetics these days, the material, depending on the color, is different. You can see how this fluorescent orange is a little bit stiffer and a little bit different than the olive. It's just kind of the way things are. I like to make this one about an inch and a half shorter just to keep working on a nice bait fish taper. And once you get that like you like, wrapped around the jig, loose wraps, get it around that top so it matches up with the olive that you tied in. Just work it around until it gets there. Once you're happy, pull tight and wrap it back over itself. And start cranking down on it. Sometimes you get ones that travel. You can just trim those out if you'd like. But that looks pretty good. So we're just going to clean up this thread head and we'll be done. I am going to hit this head with an olive Sharpie just so it's not white. But that's not entirely necessary. But you can also just buy olive thread. I'm just out of... This is the only gel spun I have with me right now. So now when you're making your whip finish, you want to do this a few times. Again, because this gel spun is really slippery. So you really want to crank down on this so your thread wraps aren't going to move. So you don't waste all this time you spent tying a nice jig. I'll come in. This one's pretty dead, but I'll get enough. I just want this to be not quite as white. It's not a crazy big deal. I think it finishes your jigs off well. Sometimes you guys slip down to that thinner one if you got wraps that get caught between the head and the jig head. Now come in with whatever head cement you want to use, and you are all set. I'll have a link to this in the description to some of the materials so you can buy this. This is a super fun jig to tie, really cheap, and you can use it to really fit whatever forage you have in your area. Hit that with your light. And that is all done. Really fun jig. And in a minute here, I'll put it in my tank so you can see how it looks. Thanks for watching and have a good day.